tapu ki he tō tahai o tua, me awhiwhio I o tau o torotonga, tapu ki kere kere I kin. Pea kua kore ke o whamamau atu ngai tala whatapu ko tō pe, o tala mo kāpui me waha o pe. Ka tā moko e whaingamari koe ni ki o whakahoko atu, tau tala noa, o tau kōlawe, ki e aho whakoa koe ni. Ki moe o tua whaftai ki o tō inai, tau I off tau I lama hao e whaimak tau tau, tau lawe mono ai I e aho whakakoloa koe ni. A malone le ni san polo vanaka talo whalawa ki o rana, talo hani, maloni. Kamna Māori and warm Pacific greetings to you all, ladies and gentlemen. Edmund Whihoko here, your host for the Talanoa webinar for today. And I welcome you all and thanks for joining us for this lovely morning. I would like to acknowledge the community groups and the NGOs throughout Aotearoa that's joining us for our lovely webinar for today. And also those from government agencies tuning in from wherever you are to, looking for ways and insights to inform your work. I acknowledge those who are joining us from various areas and different corners across the globe as well. We appreciate that this is a time of many challenges to community organizations in whānau. And so with the Talanoa today, with Dr. Hernandez, and what he has to present today is very relevant to how we can work to ensure that the community research supports specific knowledge, practice for our families and communities. Throughout the webinar, we invite you to log in to the Community Research Facebook page to post any questions for our guest for today, Dr. Daniel Hernandez. And if you want to be notified when we are broadcasting our next webinar, join our Facebook page, Community Research, and the community research discussion groups. And you can also subscribe to our monthly e-news by emailing communications@communityresearch.org.nz. That is communications@communityresearch.org.nz. Today's webinar, we have the chance to learn about more about how we can work together and regarding research and evaluation to support cultural and Indigenous practice and knowledge in our work. Our guest for today is the one and only Dr. Daniel Hernandez, a PhD scholar from the University of Auckland, a lecturer in the field of anthropology with a PhD in ethnomusicology, a man who is from the awesome country, the coffee beans, Guatemala, and where he grew up, and then with the rest of his family at Rose Park out in Utah, the United States of America, before making the move up to Aotearoa, where he met his lovely wife from Kirikiriroa, and then is currently residing here in the city of Sales. Dr. Hernandez is a proud Guatemalan, but also the Tongans have claimed him for this session as well. So with that, I'd like to take this time to welcome our guest of honor. Before we ask, can I please get the technician to upload the PowerPoint while we have our kava here to keep the nerves and break the ice while we talanoa for today. And if you're tuning in, please feel free to enjoy your kava by taking a sip of your coffee. Right after this cup, we will hand it over to Dr. Hernandez and the presentation for today. Oh.
Kulak sekat, nunang lavis samura arsia, nutat Fernandez tekun, inak kitche winak, sota ofa, tena koutou katoa. So that was hopefully I can live up to some of that introduction that Edmund gave. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share some ideas with you all today, and hopefully add some insights and ideas that could be valuable as you move across in whatever space you might be, in. If we could do the next slide, please. And so just to give you a little bit of an outline of some of the things that I'm going to try to touch on, I'm going to do an introduction to ideas about identity. There's only so much we're going to be able to actually cover, of course, but hopefully be able to plant the seeds for interest and further thinking about this topic and idea, and some questions that I have for you to consider and think about as I'll share some of these is, where do you see yourself? Who do you see? Who also isn't there? And so think about what's visible, what isn't, within the things that I'll be sharing. But also the question of who decides identity, right? And so this is a tension that I hope that you'll keep in mind as I present a few different ideas about thinking about identity and how that might impact our everyday life, our professional spaces, our academic spaces, our community experiences, how much of the way we experience the world and come to see the world, how much of that is influenced from the way we do internally versus how we experience it externally. So how much does the society that we live in influence the way we come to see ourselves and each other, the institutions that we participate in or that we belong to, how does that influence it? And so it's something to kind of keep in mind. And so just as Edmund was mentioning, my whakapapa is Winak, or also known as the Mayans, from the highlands of Isimuleo or Guatemala. However, I was raised in Rose Park in Salt Lake City, Utah, and there wasn't a whole lot of knowledge about my whakapapa. And so if I was hanging out with Tongans, they'd be like, "Oh man, it's the shortest Tongan we've ever seen." Or maybe they'd ask, "Oh, is this person Mexican or is this person Navajo?" Being here in Aotearoa, I've had similar things as well, where up in Auckland, sometimes people go, "Oh, we Pacifica, Sabo, and Tongan." However, when I went to the South Island, to Waiponamu, people asked if I was Maori. In the UK, people thought I was South Asian, or the original Indian. So just as an example, right, there's always these external forces and identifiers that influence the way that we either accept those, or we contest them, or we challenge them, or we fuse them depending on our circumstances. So be mindful of that with the examples that I'll give. And then the last question I want to raise for all of you to kind of be thinking about as well is, how does identity impact our society, our politics, education, research, but also well-being, right? If you're not sure of who you are, then those outside forces can have quite a bit of an impact, and sometimes that can be negative. And so that's why I think identity is really important to think about, interrogate, reflect on, to again deal with the role of well-being that it has for us as well. And the reason I pose these questions to all of you is because I can't cover everything, and I'm just going to try to introduce a few ideas. You'll be better equipped within your own space to kind of begin thinking about how this might or may not apply in the spaces that you're in. If we could go to the next slide, please. And so the question then, who are you? What informs your worldview? How do you make sense of the world? And another way of asking that is, what has influenced you, and how is your worldview changing, if that's the case as well? How have you come to see the world? What are the forces that impact that? If we want to better understand each other, if we want to be able to improve our cross-cultural communication, having an idea of who we are is paramount, of course. Having an understanding of who you are will help as you understand others, and vice versa. The more we get to know about other people, our connections, our differences, our similarities, that'll also help us, I believe, inform ourselves. So myself working with Tongans has helped me tremendously, not only to better understand Tongan worldviews and the spectrum of diversity of Tongan experience, but also that has helped me better understand even my own experience and even my own ancestral knowledge and background also. And so both of those have been kind of helpful in reinforcing each other. And so a few other things to think of as well, right? So a few things that may have influenced the way you came to see the world. Family. How do you define family? Is family, a mother and a father and children and just the nuclear setting? Or is family a kainga or ainga? where you have a large network of people that might be defined through, in English, you would say, extended family networks or village-based or such. Do you know who your ancestors are? How does that influence the way that you have come to see the world? For myself, in trying to honor my ancestral teachings, I have to consciously nurture that if I want to maintain that present within my life. Do you identify with a tribe or a sub-tribe, a clan, iwi or hapu, toiwi, for example? What about place, right? So I have this whakapapa from Ishimuleo. However, most of my life, I've lived in an urban setting, in a working class community, in the high altitude, dry, arid climate of Utah. And now I've lived for over 5 years now here in Aotearoa. So how has place been a big part of how I came to see the world? Those are two very different places. In Utah, one of the unofficial religions, I would argue, is what you might call US football. When I arrived here, I learned it was rugby. And so that's just to give you an example of things that you saw, whether you're a fan or not. Those are things that were kind of unique to those different places, as well as a lot of other things. And then also experiences. What have you experienced in the world? How have you experienced things? How does that inform who you are? And in one way, ultimately, you might think that who you are and how you come to see the world is based off of your relationships, your experiences, and how those take place in a particular environment. Language as well. How many languages do you speak? How many variations of a language do you speak? Gender, sexuality. What about physical, neurological ability? How do you access a building? How do you access different spaces? Do you think about that or not? And so those are different things that may influence in the way we kind of come to understand the world, how we come to make sense of the world around us, and a few things to get you to begin thinking about, just a couple of points of reference that may help.
And on that point, while we have our cup of kava, I want you to ponder on the idea on who are you, based on the questions that have been put forward by Dr. Daniel Hernandez, while we enjoy the cup and the beverage of the Pacific to continue our lovely Dalanoa for today.
Edmund, if we could go to the next slide, please. And so continue to build on this question: who are you? What informs your worldview? How do you make sense of the world? There's a couple of other concepts and ideas that come into play here. So give you another example. In the United States, there's an external force that identifies you based off of race or ethnicity. However, when that arrives, the only two ethnicity options, at least until recently, was Hispanic or non-Hispanic, which means Spaniard or Spanish or not Spanish. And then they had a list of races: American Indian, African American, white or Caucasian, European, etc. And more they've added that. For a long time, for example, Pacific Islanders have been housed under Asian Pacific Islander. There was a lot of work to try to disaggregate that and to separate that. And now you'll find Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander in a more kind of appropriate way of thinking about this particular group. And so those are those forces. When I arrived to Aotearoa, however, when I applied to the University of Auckland many years ago, they didn't ask me about my race, but they did ask my ethnicity. And there was like 40 options, more than I've ever seen before. I still ended up putting other and filling in my own. But again, to begin thinking about what is this thing we talk about when we say ethnicity or culture. The idea of culture in our mainstream kind of vocabulary is actually fairly recent. And if we think about the long span of our genealogy as people, as human beings, what kind of culture are we talking about? Is it a particular culture? And if so, how is it being identified? Is it corporate culture? Is it consumer culture? Is it mainstream culture? Is it Tongan culture? Is it Mayan culture? What kind of culture within that is it? And so there's all kinds of layers and complexity even with that term. And so one thing that I would encourage you to think about is trying to think about how specific you can make it, but then at the same time, how broadly it is also used. My work with people of the Moana has been primarily with Tongans, but other folks as well. And it's really interesting for me to learn from the spectrum of diversity with folks in Utah, for example, versus here in Tamaki Makaurau, or even in the Kingdom of Tonga. And even there, Tonga Tapu versus Vava'u, or Hawaii, or the Niwas, or Ewa. There are different ways in which people come to understand what it means to be, even if they share an identity with other people. And so that's something to think about. Race is another one, right? It's not one that I think is talked about as much here as in the United States. However, it still plays a huge, significant role. It's a very recent idea. And again, in regards to our history as human beings, it's a very problematic idea as well, because it can be based off of superficial markers that we then have assumptions of behavior or ancestry, right? So when people see me, what they see is race, right? They see brown skin, they're making an assumption as to where I come from, and that's why they ask these different things. However, I do have some European ancestry. Nobody has ever asked me if I'm European or white. They'll always ask me if I'm fill in the blank, a dark-skinned people, or people who are believed to be or assumed to be of darker skin, right? So race has often been based off of skin color, hair texture, eye shape, and then assumptions about the behaviors of that person, or assumptions about even their culture or ancestry based off of their appearance. And so it's something that still exists within our world today. It's something that has been institutionalized. There has been laws about it, even here in Aotearoa and in other places, as when regards to property or access to different things, which is one of the reasons why it's still tracked today, because it's continually still reproduced. And so while it's a problematic idea, it's also an important one to have an understanding of, because it still orders a lot of the way the world exists and as we experience it, even though that'll be different across different places. So that goes to the next point of nationality, right? Different nations have constructed both culture and race in different ways, historically and presently. And how do you identify within the nation? Nations also very recent in span of human history, the way we organize as peoples. Before there was territories, and even today nations are still, sometimes those borders shift and change. And so do you identify with the nation? If so, how do you identify, right? Here in Aotearoa, do you identify as a New Zealander, or do you identify as a Kiwi? Or do you identify as a certain kind of Kiwi or a certain kind of New Zealander? This would be the same in the United States. And so again, something to think about in regards to how these ideas of belonging to a nation inform the way we experience the world. Even if we think about it or not, sometimes we might not, sometimes we will. I mean, sometimes people identify more with the city they grew up in, or even the neighborhood, or even the street, depending on where you're at in the world. Yet we still have this kind of larger idea that we experience. And if you have the privilege of travel, when we traveled before our current pandemic situation, you're going to experience the world through the nations, through the way that nations see themselves and the way that they see each other. Which line do you go in, and so on and so forth. And on the same token, color, this is related to race, but even within a particular racial group, you might have a spectrum of skin tones within there. How does that influence those particular groups? Religion is another huge one as well. And in both places that I've lived, both the United States and here in New Zealand, we have this holiday coming up called Christmas, and it's recognized by the nation, right? And so whether you're Christian or not, whether you celebrate that holiday or not, you're going to have a day off for it. You're going to have this period off for it. And so how does that influence, again, the way we come to see the world, what we consider to be normal, what we consider to be, not, if it's not within those things? Which kind of religion do you identify with? Do you identify as non-religious as well? And how does that influence, again, the way you come to see yourself, come to see the world, and also how other people come to see you? Age is another one. How old are you? What generation? I think me and Edmund are in between. I'm maybe on the older millennials and he's maybe the younger, and we got Gen Z and Zoomers as well coming up. And so how does the different generation influence you? I would say that, at least in my experience with popular music, once you start complaining about the music of the new generation, that means you're probably older. That seems to be something that continually gets recycled throughout the ages. Class, socioeconomic status is another one. Social status might be about how you're dressed or how you present yourself. Even the language that we speak, you can speak English, but maybe we dial it up to quote unquote professional. If we're in a certain professional setting, that reflects social status, economic status as well, and they're often related to each other. I like to think about this category in regards to food. What kind of things do you eat? Do you look for quantity to get full, or are you looking for, high quality that you might have a smaller amount that you get to savor the taste? That to me is often a reflection of socioeconomic status as well. And there's plenty more, but it looks like we're ready for our next cup. So we'll do that.
And while we drink, a question that I'm going to put forward to everyone is that what informs your worldview? We're currently in unprecedented times and challenging times, and our worldviews have changed as a result of COVID-19. So what informs your worldview today, and if it's still the same pre-COVID, and how do you make sense of the world? Can we get the next slide up, please?
Whoa. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah. What did you already think of? So with all the list of those things, have you thought about that stuff before? Maybe you have. Maybe you've thought about it in more depth than I'm able to at this moment. Maybe you haven't thought of some of those. If so, why have you? Why haven't you? How much of that has to do with the external influence on identity? How much of that has to do with your own, and so forth? If we can go to the next slide, please. And so some examples of how this matters. One is, are we in New Zealand or are we in Aotearoa, or are we somewhere in between those two? If you click again on the slide, there we go. You can see two different perspectives there in regards to the relationship to this place. New Zealand is one, Aotearoa is another. North Island is one, Te Ikamau is another, right? South Island is another, Te Waiponamu is another, right? And it not only physically orients you differently in this place, but could reflect different politics as well. When I arrived here, I feel like I arrived in New Zealand and I was searching for Aotearoa. And part of that has to do with my experience through customs and immigration. And what I wasn't coming through a pōwhiri. I was going through what was the rules and the laws of the dominant group here in this nation state, right? So those are two identities that exist at the same time in the same place, and sometimes maybe they're in tension with each other. Sometimes maybe they're moving towards a relationship or a partnership. And so some things to think about. If you could click again, there'll be a few other things that will come up. Sweet. So some other examples of how identity plays out kind of in everyday life. Just the simple question of asking who you are. What's your name, right? In English, I'm asking what is, right? So is a thing. What is, so the thing, and then your name. So possessive to you, something that you own, that is yours, right? So that's a particular worldview already, even in asking that question. If I were to shift to Spanish, the common question is, ¿Cómo te llamas? What are you called, right? So it's a very different way of orienting how you're positioned as well. What are you called is something that you're known by, but what other people are referring to you as. So it's asking, how are other people calling you? What do people call you? Another one, shift to Tonga, Kohai ho hingoa. Who is your name, right? So now we shift completely as well from the idea of is as a thing to a personhood. Who is your name? Are you named after an ancestor? Who named you, right? That's another one as well. Who does your name represent? Who do you embody with your name? Maybe multiple generations, maybe multiple ancestors, maybe a chiefly title. very different way of orienting yourself in the world. And you can see how these very different ways could lead to misunderstandings and miscommunications in a shared space with these different worldviews kind of come together, and maybe they're colliding until there's a way to kind of remedy them, to bring them together. If you could click again, there's another one that'll come up. Another one, to jump back to the idea of gender. This is another one that's in our everyday speech. In English, he, she, him, her, these are gendered pronouns that refer to two kind of dominant ideas around masculinity or femininity, right? And so people are gendered. However, if we jump to Spanish, not only people are gendered, everything is gendered. The table is gendered, the bowl is gendered, the door is gendered, everything has a gendered, and it's él, ella, él or la. And so that's a gendered, kind of worldview that moves beyond even people. If we jump to Tagalog, which is one of the languages in the Philippines, they don't have these gendered pronouns in the same kind of way. You could say siya or sa kanya, and that would be used for men or women or queer folks or even other objects, right, as well. And so you're forced to think about gender differently in that language, in that worldview. Not that there isn't an idea of gender there, it's just constructed differently. It operates differently. And so you don't have it when you refer to people in Tongan as well. Ia, right? Like kia te ia, for example, would also be, that doesn't necessarily mean masculine or feminine or something else or someone else. It refers to a lot of different things, and so the context becomes very important. So again, when we think about people who maybe come from these different worldviews and then are learning English, how do these things get translated or mistranslated? And then vice versa. How do ideas that in our modern English language, because again, our modern English language has so many words from around the world that have been absorbed into it. It's very different from if we were to look at the Germanic English of 500 years ago. Where's the mistranslations and the miscommunications that take place in these interactions? And so the last kind of idea that I wanted to delve into a little bit is thinking about, again, diverse and multiple contexts in our experiences in place and our relationships. And one is because it's something that I'm passionate about and trying to understand more, is this idea of diaspora, or this kind of scattering or spreading out of a group of people. There's another term as well, transnational, that's based off of if you have kind of multiple national experiences based off of nations. I like diaspora because I think that sometimes people think about themselves beyond nation, sometimes in a village context or a clan context or in kind of more specific ways in a city context or neighborhood, and then identify with a cultural group that may or may not be part of a nation, or might be, for example, my own background. I identify as Winak or as Mayan. However, today, the Maya territory is split up between Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras. And so we have 4 nations that have kind of split up this cultural region of relatives. And so that's why for me, when I say Mayan, it's kind of beyond the nation because they exist in multiple nations. If we think about Temona Nuyakiwa, that might also be another one. We begin thinking about these bigger ways in which that operates. Do people migrate? Do people occupy? What is your relationship to power in regards to the places that you're at? And when it comes to movement or genealogies of movement, were you displaced or did you choose to go somewhere? What were the forces that influenced the need to go somewhere or the desire to go somewhere? And those are different things that are important to think about. But then also assimilation, again, thinking about power. Are we in New Zealand or are we in Aotearoa? Are we somewhere in between? Are we moving towards one or the other? Are we creating something new, different altogether that's fusing those? And how is that reflected in our institutions, right? The forms you have to fill out, the popular culture, the music, the movies, the social media. How are these ideas continually reproduced? And do those push us to assimilate to a certain idea of identity or to challenge it? Well, looks like we're ready for another cup, and then I'll wrap it up after that.
And if you're enjoying this, learning Espanol 101, I'm enjoying the listening to the Spanish language here this morning. So I'm going to try and repeat that. Como te llamas is, remember, is more than just what is your name. So thoroughly enjoying the Talanoa for today, where we drink kava from the volcanic islands of Hawaii.
Malo admit. If we can go to the next one, please. So just to kind of summarize again, I'm going to just remind you of some of those early questions. Where do you see yourself? Who do you see? And who is not there? Whether that's the questions that I've asked, or whether that's in the spaces that you work in, or live in, or play in, or whatever. How is identity represented there or not? And then also, again, returning to the question, I would argue that identity is implicated in everything that we do, in our society, in our politics, in our education, in our research. What are you learning? How are you learning? And also well-being, right? If you don't know who you are and somebody else is telling you who you are, and that's all you have to go off of, what is that image? And is it a positive one or is it a negative one? And how does that impact how you experience the world and even your own well-being? So I'll turn those questions back to you, because you're all in different spaces, and to kind of honor those spaces that you're in. But that's me. Appreciate everyone listening, and happy to do my best to respond to questions and answer any that I can.
Thank you, Dr. Hernandez. And we're going to go to your Q&A. There's been questions flying left, right, and center.
Yep, kia ora, korua. Nice to see you. Thank you for an amazing, thought-provoking presentation, Daniel, and lovely to see you both enjoying the talanoa over the kava bowl. So we've got a couple of questions that have come through from participants. One is from DH, not sure what that stands for, but he or she is wanting to know if, or maybe they are wanting to know, if in your research, are there identity identifiers that tend to be more prominent for people than others?
Yeah, definitely. I think trying to think of how to frame this. For sure, I think that for example, I'll just give you an example with some of my research with Tongan folks. Reason why kava is so important, kind of like what Edmund's talked about in his work, for some of the groups that I've worked with, is because it's a cultural classroom. And if you think about Utah, I think, well, when I left, it was about 80% European descent, white folks. So not a lot of different sites to think about what it means to be Tongan. And so a place like the Waikaba, for example, becomes very important to reinforce that identity. Whereas, for example, if I'm in Tongatapu or Hawaii in the Kingdom of Tonga, kava is certainly very important still, but there's all these other sites of cultural reinforcement to your identity, such as language being spoken, such as the physical landscape from where that language comes from, to a variety of other institutions and practices, whether it's a kokanga or something else. And so definitely, I think that wherever you're at, there are dominant ideas about identity that come to influence the way you see yourself. And when you're further away from, and I'm trying to be careful in the way I say that, but when it's perceived like you're further away from a particular identity, that identity sometimes can tend to become bigger and bigger. So in Utah, for example, if you're Tongan, maybe you begin to think of yourself as Polynesian or Pacific Islander or Pacifica, or even as a brown person. And so it can tend to kind of get bigger in that sense. So I think definitely whatever the dominant ideas are in a place, good, bad, or ugly, those often end up.
Thank you, Daniel. We've got another question, or actually it's an observation, and then I'll follow in with the next question. So David noted that culture is often optional for organisations, that there's certain things that are required, like health and safety training, but often the participation in cultural events like pohiri or mihi whakatau are often seen as optional. Have you got any thoughts around that?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's whatever is appropriate for you in your space and where you're at, but I think it is potentially an opportunity to challenge that idea of culture as well. And so that's one of the reasons we think about culture. What do we mean when we say culture? I would argue that there's always a culture at play, but sometimes the dominant culture is not being identified and is considered normal, or the norm that we should just assume is there. And so in those cases, I think it's important to say, hey, wait a minute, this health and safety, how it's being presented, how it's being thought about, where does this come from? It comes from somewhere. And if we locate that, whether that's through kind of a colonial European relationship here, then that begins, I think, the possibility of beginning to think of like whose culture is being presented and dominating or maybe even occupying a space. And if we really want to live in kind of a partnership reality, which I think is a very generous offer from Tangata Whenua, then I think it's important to identify those sites for the culture that they are and say, hey, how do we bring in Maori culture or even a specific Hapu or Iwi culture into this space, because the one that's being presented is coming from maybe a corporate culture even. And so that's still culture. It's a different kind of culture, but I think identifying it might help open up possibilities to challenge, expand, and broaden the possibilities in that.
And if you're in that space, I challenge you to make those courageous conversations with your superiors. We've seen numerous times where people have tried to get away from such activities like pōhiri and also kava ceremonies and all that kind of stuff. But I challenge you, if you're in that space and you're true and passionate about your culture, you got to stand strong and have those courageous conversations. Kim, you can ask the next question and we're going to have.
Sure. So Rosabelle, who has identified herself as a Mexikiwi. Nice to hear from you, Rosabelle. She's been very she's felt a lot throughout your presentation, but she has a question in particular related to identity and mental health, and I guess struggles with identity and mental health. So have you got any thoughts or reflections on that?
Yeah, I mean, take everything I say with a grain of salt, of course, because this is not my specific area of experience, other than my personal experience, but definitely I feel like it is very much linked together. For myself, you know, growing up in the environment that I did, there were a lot of different ideas as to who I am, who I was supposed to be, what I was supposed to act like, and I would begin to reproduce those things even within myself. I'll give you an example. Like in the neighborhood I grew up in, we had a lot of, I guess, dairies and fast food, and that was most of what I saw. There was no, you know, organic food stores and whatever, and so I began to identify healthy food as white food. And part of that was a sense of pride in where I was from and not wanting to think that what was in my area was bad. And then later on, as I began to having to confront and face this in my adulthood, I realized, wait a minute, there's probably something wrong with thinking that the unhealthy food is brown food and the healthy food is white food. And so I had to really interrogate a lot of those things, which was a challenging thing. And I think was a big part of, I mean, I wouldn't have identified it as a mental health at that time because that was also stigmatized, right? But now in retrospect, I definitely think that of all those different layers of identity, I think identity is absolutely, at least in my personal belief and experience, linked with mental health and well-being. And it's something that I would like to look into more as I continue on in my research, but it definitely continued to come up throughout my own. Having a sense of community, sense of belonging is a crucial part of being a human being. And if we don't have that, or if we have disconnects within that, it's going to have negative impacts, I would say, for sure.
Thanks, Daniel. In terms of following on, we've got a question from Kurt asking you to comment on, I guess, what we call cultural schizophrenia, coming to terms with multiple backgrounds, cultures, and ethnicities, and how can you embrace or promote being more than one thing when you're working with non-homogenous groups of people, and how do you do this in a way that's not token?
Yeah, great question. I think I'll just share what I mean. For me, I take lessons from hip hop culture, and I think about the African American experience and the dislocating, the world-altering, you know, tragedy of the transatlantic slave trade, and the resilience, despite that, to make these brilliant cultural productions that are linked to an African indigeneity, but also are being produced in these new contexts and settings in relation with a variety of other peoples, such as American Indians, and even people of the Moana have had some influence in the popular music that we would think of today coming out of the US. And in hip hop culture, there's this value this cultural value of keeping it real. And for me, that has been a very healing value, and just being honest and transparent, which I wasn't always able to do as efficiently as I can today. And being able to just stand in a place and say, yeah, my whakapapa is this. I have ancestors from Quiché, Sotujil, Cachiquel, and Mam peoples in Ishimuleo, with also European and Afro ancestry as well. But I grew up in Salt Lake City as a Mormon with a bunch of Tongans and Samoans, and I live here in Aotearoa now. And so I'll joke around here, I'll be like, I'm a Mayan living in Aotearoa, hanging out with Tongans. And for me, that's just part of like this keeping it real, of just being honest with it. And that to me is also a healing practice of just being transparent with embracing that. Again, the society we live in often tries to put us in neat little boxes, but I would argue that all people, if you want to look closely enough, hold multiple identities or multiple within themselves. And I think the more we embrace it, the better we can push to broaden our world as well.
Before Kim fires the next question at you, can you give us a song that that has given you that sense of pride and identity? And I think that might give the person who asked the question an opportunity to rejuvenate a sense of, I have no idea what cultural what the technical word was. Yeah.
Oh man, there's heaps. I think I would just say Bob Marley was big for me growing up, for sure. I think he's big here in Aotearoa as well. And I think part of it was because he embraced this, multiple identities, and often that came through his music, right? His religious identity, his racial backgrounds, his cultural backgrounds, the position in place, but also working with Tongans. One that I don't speak Tongan fluently, but a song that always kind of stirs me and even gets me to think is Haloko Papa, that was penned by the late Queen Salote Tupou III, and put to music by the group, I can't remember the name right now.
Lomepeau.
Yeah, Lomepeau. And in that song, she talks about her multiple lineages and her ties to Samoa, her ties to Fiji, her ties in different places in Tonga. That's what I was thinking about, that put the word to music. But that song to me always stirs me and makes me feel mafana, this warmth, because here she is, she's asserting these multiple lineages that come together in her, and that is what gives her mana, right? Is that she has these multiple ancestries, rich ancestries that have come together to become one.
So we can put online the song, the Haloko Papa song, and also the translation to the song is in Dr. Hernandez's PhD thesis, which you can find online. And in the famous words of Bob Marley, don't worry, everything's gonna be all right. Over to you, Kim.
Kia ora korua. Thanks, Ed. So we've got a question from Sandra about, it's a research-based question. So how can we best or better reflect inclusion in culture, ethnicity, and still collect data that's meaningful? And I guess part of it too is the challenge between being counted in quantitative research and understanding the context of people's lives through qualitative research. So that's a big question.
Yeah, my guess advice or response or thought would be to be upfront and be critical. I think all research, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, has limits. I mean, there was a word count limit in my thesis that I far exceeded and had to cut to get back in. And even now, writing stuff, it's always difficult for me to finish writing something because there's so much more. And I think what's helped me is being clear about the boundaries of what the research can actually cover and what it doesn't cover. And I think stating both of those can be helpful of, hey, this research is going to show this, it's able to show this, but it doesn't take into consideration these things. And so I think trying to always leave room open for more, for me, is something that I've been trying to do. And that's for me a value that I've learned from Tongans and Fijians and Samoans as well, of this sense of kind of humility. And so for me, I try to bring that into my research as well. I was like, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. This is what I think I'm able to do. But there are these other things that I'm just not able to cover. And I try to leave room for that as well, because there's always going to be more to tell. But that would just be my advice.
So we've got another question from Andra, which is, given the impact of colonization and intergenerational trauma, migration, I guess urban drift, identity can often be stolen or lost, and there's often layers of shame and stigma from institutions oppressing you, embracing your culture. So I think part of this is, how can we in our daily lives or in our work lives as well, or with those institutions we're coming up against, reclaim our identity, and how can those who work with us best support us on this journey?
Oh man, another big one.
Yeah.
I think to go for those who how they can best work with us, I would say be willing to give up power in some regards, depending on the space and what that means in a different context. But also one that would apply to everyone, I think, is being generous. I think about, I'm grateful that I had parents who were able to instill important seeds of identity for me growing up. That being said, there was a lot of stuff that we also didn't talk about. I mean, my parents left Isimuleo during the Civil War, during a lot of violence. There was a lot of stuff that was not talked about. I began to kind of poke at those bruises as I got older because I wanted answers and trying to unpack things. And so I had to kind of build off of what I did have, but also kind of go on a journey to figure that out. And I think for me, one of the things that I think is important in that process is being generous with yourself and with others in what you know and what you don't know, and what you can't know that isn't your fault because of what's been inherited, and what you can do now moving forward. And I think that's how I'm trying to deal with it at the moment. That's been helped me out as well. And so even though I might run into stuff that I might not agree with now, I try to remember where I was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and be generous with that person who may be at the beginning of their journey. And I'm still, on a journey of knowledge as well, constantly. And so I try to give myself room for how I might change in the way I come to think about stuff in the coming years as we go forward. But that would be my advice in regards to that.
We've got another question, which I think Charles, I kind of combined Charles and Kurt's comments, but I think there's another little piece in there around, how can we guide people to be able to better respect diversity of identity? How can we kind of create that cultural shift in those settings that we're in, both as community workers or researchers? How do we make that kind of a standard of practice, I guess?
Yeah, that's a big one too. I think depending on where you're positioned or how you're positioned, how much power you have within a particular setting or institution or not will influence what you can or can't do, or what you should or shouldn't do. So I think there's different responsibilities for different people. And so keep that in mind. But I think one of the things that I've been trying to do more as of late is present things to draw from some of the Black radical tradition in the United States, to be unapologetic, right? If I've come to the knowledge of something and its value, I try to present it as such, unapologetically, right? Without giving, asking for permission in regards to having to explain why it's valuable, but present it as the norm that I experience it as. That's one way of doing it, I think. And then another way, depending on how you're positioned in a particular place, would be in presenting and doing it. And sometimes, because of the world we've inherited, you might have to break some social rules. You might have to diverge and kind of move to the edge of things, or kind of try to shift that way. And I think the more we do that, the more we invite others as well, potentially, to kind of move to these different places of thinking about paradigm shifts, if you will, and looking to those who are doing it. I think that's another thing that, while I appreciate my experience in academia, sometimes I get frustrated with how isolating it can be. And sometimes there's conversations happening there that I'm like, man, y'all are behind. This has already been hashed out and debated online or in a community setting. And so I think trying to be aware of multiple spaces is helpful too. Like if, for example, even in my work, sometimes there's not a lot of academic literature for the things that I'm interested or researching, but there's plenty of poetry, songs, stories that do exist. And so for me, valuing that in the same way, so in a research setting, I reference Talanoa, I reference music lyrics, and I reference them in the same way that I do an academic journal. And so that's another way that I try to assert a paradigm shift of the knowledge is here, but we have to think bigger than sometimes the spaces we're confined to. Hopefully that helps respond to some of that.
And if you're in the field of research and you're currently doing some research around culture and identity, and you saw value in our Talanoa today, please feel free to reference us as well. You can cite us in a very academic and according to academic guidelines as well. Okay, any questions?
I think we're catching up. There are a few. Yep, no, I think we've just about caught up on the questions. I think, Daniel, can you just share, I guess, a piece of research that you're most proud of?
Oh, man.
Where does it start?
I think I'm proud of all of it because it's not, even though I might be a lead author in some, like, I'm not the only person involved in it. And I think that's why it's hard for me to pick one. The majority of the research that I've published is with colleagues, with friends, with community members. And so each one of those I'm proud of because they represent kind of creating a record in a moment in time of a lot of ideas that I never saw, you know, that weren't available for me when I was going to university, that weren't always available for me, even in my kind of everyday life. And so anything that brings that makes more visibility, something that can be related to, I'm proud of all of it because it's been with other people. So I don't want to be like, hey, who I enjoyed working with the most? I enjoyed all of them. But I think, yeah, any work that reaches people, that's relevant, that people respond, hey, they don't have to agree with all of it, but if it's meaningful, and it got them to think, or I was able to see myself in here, that's what I feel the most proud of, I think, when that happens.
We've got another question from David, which is really, it's kind of it's quite a long question, but it's very pertinent, and it's around morally contextualizing these types of conversations as either right or wrong. And the consequence of doing this, I guess, when you're having those courageous conversations that you referred to, Edmund, is that people double down on their opinions and they become quite fixed, and others come in feeling quite self-righteous in terms of the challenging. So the question related to that is there any way in which we can help people advance their cultural awareness through broadening their perspectives, or, you know, a preventative approach rather to building the story? That's a great question from David.
Yeah, the simple answer is have that conversation around kava, and if someone gets out of line, give them a big cup. The longer answer would be, this is something I'm regularly navigating as well, and this includes, you know, multiple contexts of, I have a very different conversation with friends and colleagues and relatives in the United States versus here in Aotearoa, versus people in other places also. And so I think for me, one thing that I've also learned from the Tongan community and in the Whaikava space is, if I'm new to a space, I try to learn the rhythm of that place first. I try to get to know people first. I try to build relationships first before I tell them what I think. Because if I tell them what I think up front, I might not have as many friends as I do today. But if I build a relationship first, and if we're friends, then the hard conversation is a lot easier, because we're already building off of something that goes beyond the point of disagreement or that doubling down. And smaller, like when I teach, for example, sometimes I don't have the amount of time to become friends with all of my students, even though I'd like to. And so what I do in that space, when I don't have that opportunity, is I try to encourage understanding first. And I say, hey, your opinions are valuable, your position is what it is, and I'm not here to change that, but I want you to identify it and try to hold on to it and suspend it for a while, because if not, you're never going to understand this in the context that it comes from. So I try to encourage understanding first and then critical response after. So for me, a critical response is way more meaningful if you can actually speak to the thing that you disagree with some knowledge or authority of what that position would actually claim, or what those people would actually say within that. So again, different strategies. Kava, seek for understanding first, but also the relationships are incredible in transcending those types of barriers.
I'll just add that in my team, I'm currently, part of my role is to deliver cultural trainings from a Pacific perspective. So what I'll do is I'll put up a link on the community research page. If you're keen to participate in this training, please feel free to register. You'll be having kava with me and learning more about Pacific perspectives on many things, including the workplace as well.
That's very timely, because we had Sam Tutahi ask about whether or not you're holding any of these kava talanoa discussions in person, and they're very happy to be contacted in relation to that. So Sam, I hope that responds to that, and just, yeah, open to you guys for your final reflections. Kia ora.
Final reflection.
I'm just grateful for the opportunity to share some of where I'm at now. And for those who have listened, appreciate you being generous with your time to listen from my insights at this point, and just keep room open for more, because couldn't cover it all now, and probably change my mind in a couple of years when I gain a little bit more wisdom. And so always leave room for more. Think about your identity, and I hope that you'll have the courage to assert that as you need to in the spaces that you're in. And hopefully see how important identity is in all aspects of our life, whether we think about it or not.
Awesome, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for those who are tuning in. Kim, did you have any final comments?
Just to let you know that David has invited you to come and have a coffee at the museum. He's very keen to continue the conversation. And yep, so yeah, and just a huge amount of thanks is coming through in the chat as well for your time today.
Awesome, thank you, Kim. On behalf, as host, thank you everyone for tuning in wherever you are tuning in from. I know some are tuning in from the offices, a park, their cars, wherever. And so thank you again for tuning in to this awesome talanoa regarding the importance of identity and culture. And I do hope that you can transfer some of the information that's been shared into your everyday life, and into your workplace, and influencing people about the importance of identity and culture. Brother, Dr. Hernandez, thank you so much for the talanoa for today. You've continued to inspire my educational journey, and you've inspired many others. We have a Mexikiwi here who asked the question as well. So again, thank you for the time. I know you're a very busy man, but for those who want to know more about that Dr. Hernandez research, his PhD thesis is online, and I think we can get a link online to support the talanoa for today regarding the importance of music from a Gava perspective, looking at Tonga and also in the US. So with that, just some notices for me. Please join our community research Facebook page and our community research discussion group. Again, you can also subscribe to our monthly e-news by emailing communications@communityresearch.org.nz. That is communications@communityresearch.org.nz. Our next webinar is on Wednesday, 16th of December with Dr. Ancha Deckett and also Dr. Juan Tauri, scholars within the School of Criminology, exploring Indigenous research ethics. And please feel free to join our Facebook page and to get up-to-date information regarding community research. In 2021, we will be showcasing more of our Pacific scholars and researchers to share their knowledge and insights in their respective fields they belong to. So please, If you're keen to know more information, or if you're keen to share your knowledge and research, feel free to contact us via Facebook page and we will get back to you ASAP. Thank you all for joining us today. And a video copy of our webinar with Dr. Hernandez will be uploaded to share with your colleagues and friends later this week. And I would like to thank you for your time. With that, Malo Albito, take care, and I will continue to drink my kava from here. Malo Albito, ovato.
Malo.
The Community Research website offers a hub for good community research and researchers. It's the place for the public to find and share evidence about effective community practices. The website collects research and evidence and organizes these so that they can be easily accessed and used by other groups. You can access this research and browse by category, by a list of quick link topics, or by searching for something specific. All of the research is free to download. The Community Research site is all about excellence and effective practices. You can view recordings of past webinars and find out about future ones. The webinars share evidence about what's working in the community sector. Published by Community Research in 2007, the Code of Practice provides the standards and guidelines for doing research. It's the place to start if you're thinking of undertaking research with or in a community or iwi. As well as the collection of research, we keep a register of experienced researchers who are skilled at working with iwi and communities. To find a researcher who can help you, we have a filter system which allows you to find people based on location, qualification, ethnic group, and area of expertise. The Community Research website is a unique resource for the community sector to use and share. It matters because communities who learn well will do well. It matters because it evidences what's working for us. For researchers and community people alike, we've made it as easy as possible to share your research on our website. Kaua e whakama. Uploading material is quick and simple. Save your work as a PDF and head over to Share Research. Answer a few questions that help us tag and organize the research so it's easy for people to find. If you're a researcher and skilled at working with communities, you can add your details to the directory of researchers so that you can be found. Community research keeps you updated and informed. This helps make you more effective. If you want to stay updated about the latest research, informed about new resources and our upcoming webinars, head over to sign up for our e-news on the homepage. Community research is a rich resource built for and by the community. For it to reach maximum potential, we rely on you to contribute, participate, and support the resource to grow and thrive. Mā te kotahitanga e ora ai tātou.